So in the church I grew up in, one of the songs that we would sometimes sing was, "And they will know we are Christians by our love." By our love. Yes, they'll know that we are Christians by our love. And yet I think if you went to a lot of people who were not a part of a church and you asked them what they would use to describe their experience of Christianity from the outside, they may not use love as their first definition or their first explanation. In fact, I think you would see an awful lot of other things that come up much more prevalent. And I do think that there are times where we as church have been bad about, and there are times still where individual churches and church as a whole have been bad about expressing our faith not only within the confines of our worship, but also within the confines of our world. I remember very early in my ministry when I was, my very first call was in Arkansas, and so I had gone to my first church in Arkansas. I'd been there less than a year, and one of the big controversies going on at that point was the Ten Commandments being in public spaces. And so the local paper had come out and interviewed me and said, "Well, what's your opinion on this?" And I said, "Honestly, this may be a shocking opinion for a person that's associated with the church, but God's less concerned with us putting it on statues or putting it in public places and much more concerned with it being written on our hearts. Much more concerned with how we live and act on this than whether being displayed somewhere." And when it comes to the Ten Commandments, it was about the people there, whether it was Jewish people or whether it was Christians, being something different. So in Matthew's Gospel, he uses the image of light really frequently. So example, he uses in the Sermon on the Mount two really common images. Don't take a light and put it under a bushel basket. You put it up on a lampstand so it can give light to the whole house. And this is what light would look like in the ancient world. Or if you go outside of our sanctuary and look to the right, you'll see a whole bunch of lamps from the ancient world. And they're actually really small. They're not very big things. Or at the end of the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus will say to his disciples, and this is what we use when we baptize a child or we baptize an adult. We'll light a candle and say, "Let your light so shine before others. They may see your good works and give glory to your Father who is in heaven." Because for God and for Jesus, the lives that we live, they matter. And the people of Israel, when they came out of Egypt, were always meant to be something different. So the reason Jesus can use that image of a light on a lampstand or "let your light so shine before others" is that was what the people who received the Ten Commandments were to be. They were to be something different. They weren't to be like Egypt where they came out of. They were to live different. They were to order their lives differently. So and you can boil down the Ten Commandments to really two things. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind, and all your strength. Let God be the center of your life. Let God be the one who you trust in. And then you have all these commandments that are about loving my neighbor. And what does that look like? So I think most people would say, yeah, I don't want to live in a world where murder is okay, or where stealing is okay, or where the commitments we make in relationships don't matter. But there were an awful lot of people in that time and our time who look at other people who seem to be doing well and seem to be doing whatever they want and say, well, why shouldn't I copy them? Why shouldn't I do what they do? And I think, especially when we get to the commandment on coveting, we live in a world that surrounds us with things that says, hey, you should want this, you should want what other people have. You should absolutely keep up with the Joneses, keep up with your neighbors. You should be in this continual way of wanting what they have, and it's not made us happier. It's not made us better neighbors. And I do think that one of the things, and maybe this is just because I've been spending a lot of time with both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the prophets, in my own study lately. Jeremiah and Ezekiel are speaking to a time when people have put their trust in the wrong things. So they put their trust in the land that God gave them. So they said, God has given this land as our inheritance forever, and we can do with it whatever we want. And God will never take that away from us, no matter what we do, no matter how we live. And God has given us these kings in the line of David, and God will let that line reign, and we'll have that stability. And God has protected us from being invaded in the past, and God will continue to do that in the future. God has given us this temple, and so long as we have the temple, and so long as we do the sacrifices the right way, we do things the right way, we can do whatever we want throughout the rest of the time. And God has given us this city of Jerusalem built around this temple. And so long as we have these things, we know that we can trust that our life is going to be good. But they began to trust in those things rather than God, and they began to move away from this way of life that God had entrusted to them. And they began to do things that more and more like everybody else. And in both Jeremiah and Ezekiel, God's saying, I can't distinguish between you and the actions of your neighbors around you. I can't see any difference. In fact, if anything, you should have every tool to do things and live a life that's to be an example, and you're doing just the opposite. And so, again, unfortunately, Jeremiah and Ezekiel have that time of being in ministry when they're telling them, and these things that you've trusted in, God's getting ready to take these things away because you're going to go through a time of refiguring out what it means to be the people of God in this time and in this space. And, so I'm a pastor. I think worship's really important. I think it's really important for how we form our lives and our faith. But if what we do here doesn't impact the way in which you live the rest of your life, then I'm failing. And we are failing. Because this is a time that brings us together to worship, to praise, to give thanks, to be forgiven, but it's also to equip us to be something different in the midst of the world. So, I had, this was years and years ago, somebody had asked a question in a group I was a part of that said, so if I was walking down, if I was in a park in Frisco, and I was looking at people around the park, I could probably tell who was Muslim. I might be able to tell who was Jewish by the way they dressed. How would they know that a person was Christian? Now, I would think the answer we would want it to be would be by our love. By our love. That they'll know that we are Christians by our love. So I'm always on the lookout for digital or for imagery that is, I find really interesting and profound. So I'll go back to that one. This is an artist named Jason DePierre Taylor. He makes human statues out of concrete, and he submerges them. And again, it gives you some really phenomenal imagery of, and I've used this for different things like baptism and other things like this, but one of the things is if you submerge something in the sea for very long, it transforms from looking like this to looking like this. I know, it's kind of a disturbing image. I'll move away from it. And it is. It's one of those things that it does become a little bit odd. It just looks strange. But, it's one of those things to where these statues that have been placed in that environment, they become changed by that environment. And I think that one of the things that we have to continually remind ourselves is, we're called to be transformed here, not conformed out there. We're called to be centered around this loving God and loving our neighbors here so that we can go and do that out there, so that we can go out and they can know that we are Christians by our love, that we can go out Let your light so shine before others, they may see your good works and give thanks to your Father who is in heaven, that we may be that light that's placed on a lampstand. And I do think that, and again, we had the reading where Jesus comes into the temple and drives out the animals and the money changers and turns over the tables. And I do think that one of those things, the language I would use for that, and this is the language that I've developed in when I think about this. We often think of the language of anger, but I think of the language of being heartbroken. You know, Jesus comes in and sees this place which was designed to be set aside for the worship of God. And one of the things about this particular space where Jesus has come into is where this was taking place was in the court of the Gentiles. So this was supposed to be the place where the people around Jerusalem who were seeing the light that they were exhibiting were to come, and they were to come and give their worship to God. But now that place which had been reserved for that was now being used for the selling of animals. And again, it's like any church. This space, we need the space for this. Well, it's not being used, so all of a sudden it becomes a storage space, or it becomes this, or it becomes that. And Jesus was heartbroken about that. And I think that the same thing that would apply to them would apply to us. You know, that when we stop being who we are, that we always run the risk of God being heartbroken about that. And we always run the risk of God sometimes having to unsettle things among us as well. So, I'm going to wrap up here. So when people see the people who are gathered here today, as you go out from this place, as you go out into the world, may they know that you are Christians by the love that you show, by the way in which you learn how to trust God, but the way also in which you show that love towards others. And yes, that comes out in things like, of course, not bearing false witness, or not coveting, or, God forbid, don't anybody murder, okay? Okay, work with me. And again, there's a reason that we light a candle when we baptize children. We give it to our adults, and we give it to them. And again, it's that imagery of that, taking that out and let your light so shine before others, that they may see that something's different about you. They may see that the things that you do and give glory and say, there's a light to that. There's love in that. There's something I want to be a part of in the midst of that. Those must be Christians, because look how they love one another. Look at the light that shines from them into those dark places. Look at the way in which they come together and the way in which they show their trust and their faith in the actions and the lives they live. So the light set on a lampstand, the light that others see in the world, and the love that they may know that you are Christians by.